So we are live. We are live. We are live. Hello, everyone. Dr. Rose here coming to you guys from Bloom Transformation Center with the return of my podcast. It's been an interesting, 2 years and a few months because we started before the pandemic with studio audiences here doing podcasts, and of course we know how all of that kind of went over the last 2 years. And we decided, especially with May being Mental Health Awareness Month, to just relaunch the podcast. And we have some exciting shows coming up for you this month, but it's my pleasure to welcome our first podcast guest for Mental Health Awareness Month here. I like to call you P. Marie Lucas because I know that's what you are on Facebook. That is so crazy. It's Patrice Lucas, a licensed professional counselor and the founder of Indigo Transitions. And you probably know her. You guys follow her. I know I follow her, Coffee with a Counselor, as well. But I want to welcome you, Patrice. And we are on a little late because we had a little technical difficulty going on today. And in addition to that, we were going to be live here, but you guys know COVID's still out there. And it's not to say we're not wishing nothing on anybody. What Patrice said, I woke up with a sore throat and we don't want to risk it. And I appreciate that. But Patrice, please just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so honored to be here, May Mental Health Awareness Month, your first guest on the return of the podcast. And so I'm just so excited to be here today. Patrice Lucas, I'm a licensed mental health counselor here in the state of Michigan. I have my private practice, Indigo Transitions, and in that practice, I see everyone from the cradle to the grave. I work with the mamas and the babas and the birth givers with their transition through their birthing process, and all the way with the families to the end of the lifespan as a grief counselor and a grief doula, where I support people as they transition to the next stage of their lives and their grief support for the families.
Oh,
And then
grief.
Coffee with a Counselor is where I do this, come and talk about mental health.
Okay, awesome. Well, it's a pleasure. And you popped out of there for a minute, but you're back. And I want to just let folks know if you, we are kind of doing a little interesting audio here because we were having some problems with our guest audio. So if it doesn't look like, just in full disclosure, we said we're going to let y'all know because we've been up here working today trying to get this right. If you're like her lips aren't lining up with her words, it's because we're doing some creative stuff to make this happen tonight because we did not want to reschedule this because it's a very relevant topic and we've gotten a lot of interest in it, and we wanted to go live today. So you still there, Patrice? Because your camera's
I
going in
am.
and out.
I am. So I'm still here. I can hear you really
Okay.
well. The
Okay.
camera's going out a little bit for me. You're going off screen as well. So we can check in.
Okay. As long as we can hear you,
Okay.
we're good. And I'll be looking for your beautiful face to come back in whenever it does.
Good.
But I want to first of all talk about what brought this topic on. What it was probably a few months ago, and I'll have you talk about this particular status. But you shared a status. It was a very transparent and personal status that you shared that I could definitely relate to. It resonated with me, and I kind of reached out to you and I said, we need to really do a show about this and talk about just this whole topic of should you stay for the sake of the children. So if you don't mind, kind of talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. So I actually reshared a status that I had shared 10 years, 11 years prior, when I first separated from my then husband. And it basically, in the status, it said, I did it. And the status was basically about me um, moving into my now home after separating from my then husband. And in that, I shared and was really transparent. Then I just said we did it. I was very, hesitant when I was in that shame and trauma and that grief of separation and pending divorce. But I was in a better space, of course, and wanted to be more transparent and share what we did. It meant, and it meant I was able to move into this home. And I shared how I stayed for the 8 years of my marriage, 9 years of the relationship, in large because of the stigma and shame and the concern of the impact of divorce
Mm-hmm.
and separation on my children.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so in that it was, I think you talked about just it wasn't an easy journey, not at all. But that's why you even started it off with I did it because it was such a sense of accomplishment that you were able to do that. And you have how many children?
Two, so two
Mm-hmm.
children. I divorced when they were 6 and 8. My son was 6 years old, and my daughter was 8.
Okay.
We divorced that year, but the separation happened between my daughter's birthday and my son's birthday and my daughter's birthday. And so 10 days before she turned 8 that year, we
Mm-hmm.
had to flee actually. And I'm defining it as fleeing our family home because they say you don't know someone until you're divorcing them, marrying them. I think you take a trip together, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And things just became increasingly uncomfortable in the marital home. There was tension, resentment, anger. And in that status, I think I shared it around Domestic Violence Awareness Month, actually.
Okay.
And I shared in that status, and I'm paraphrasing, but the phrase, the quote kind of goes, they bark before they bite, and they start practicing on things before they began hitting you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where things were. He was just incredibly angry. He was hurt. Unfortunately, I think he may have seen this as a surprise in the separation. And so things escalated and really began to get ugly, and it wasn't safe for us to stay anymore.
Okay.
So we left when we were 15.
Yeah.
2 days before my daughter's 8th birthday.
So I want to talk because I love it because you shared your personal experience, but you also have the clinical background because you are a licensed professional counselor as well. And a lot of people know my story as well, divorcing with 4 children. Again, something we know about the stigma, but also people will oftentimes tell you that's just not advisable, not advisable. So we wanted to talk today about the pros and cons of staying and the pros and cons of leaving. And as I was preparing for this podcast, Patrice, I was just looking at statistics. I found some interesting statistics. And I know, just like you're very committed to our community, you're very committed to our culture as well. And it's interesting how, and I was surprised to see this, that 70%, 69% of all children in this country live in a two-parent household. I found that very interesting because, even growing up in the 70s, that wasn't the reality of what we saw. However, when I looked as it pertains to African Americans, that number is flipped. So 67% of African American children are actually being raised in single parent households. And so for our culture, that's the vast majority. That's the vast majority. And this is not, I want to just state this disclosure right now. This is not a podcast saying, I guess heralding that or celebrating that necessarily, but it's a podcast that kind of just really look at the whys behind that. When is it advisable? And when is it not advisable to stay? And so talk about that from your perspective. And I want to talk, you did talk about the angriness and at first they bark and then they bite, but from a clinical standpoint, what have you just kind of just noticed and generalized in your years in clinical practice as far as the benefits? Let's start with even the benefits of staying. Let's start there.
Well, some of the benefits of staying, and I can even see that although I know that the benefits of leaving far outweigh the benefits of staying,
Mm-hmm.
but it would be remiss of me and to not talk about that. I do recognize there would have been some benefits for us staying together.
Yeah.
I openly talk about how I don't consider myself a single parent because I have this very vast village. But as a single woman in the home alone with my children, most of the day-to-day care and most of the things that I have to manage and take care of is by myself. And I think we moved out of the live, but I'll continue talking because this is being recorded, everyone.
Yeah, and we're still in the live. I was just hoping, yeah, I was just hoping that you would pop back in. So I'm just waiting for your picture to come up, but you're there, so don't worry.
And so what that looks like is the benefits of staying is you have a co-parent, a built-in supposed to help you with a lot of the things. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen with divorce,
Hmm.
but oftentimes the separation of the homes, and the children going from and being in the two families, two homes, that is an interruption sometimes to the children's care. So this seamless amount of care, you all being that built-in support system for one another, not having to add in additional relationship or additional partners or children that is outside of the marriage into the existing children or the children of the marriage,
Hmm.
or the partnerships lives. So all of those are great benefits. And then you don't have to deal with the grief. I mean, there's incredible a lot of grief for every family member, including the dog,
Mm.
when there is a divorce in a relationship, right? Or there's this divestment of a relationship, whether that's marriage or other partnerships. There's grief. So you
Yeah.
don't have to deal with the grief. You don't have to deal with the stigma, the shame. And all of that is something to heal from, particularly in a
Hmm.
relationship.
Yeah, yeah. I was looking at like even some of they talk about there was a list talking about the pros and cons of staying together. And you just again covered a few that's definitely on that list. One of the emotional grief about it, the stigma, of course, well, the financial um, ramifications that oftentimes follow that separation and the lowering of the quality of the kid's livelihood if it means that the primary caregiver, if it's the mom or the dad, whomever it is missing out on that other income that's in the house. But I want to even look at something that kind of surprised me. And one of the when they talked about the pros of staying together, and one of that is that it gives you a break from even focusing on your relationship. You can take a breather from your intimate relationship with your partner. So instead of focusing on even working on that relationship, you guys decide to, we're just going to focus on providing this environment for the children, a healthy environment for the children. And these are studies that have been done that show that children actually do fare better. Let's just say that they do fare better when there are two parents in the household. But the caveat to that is that it needs to be a healthy environment. And I believe, again, for you and me personally, when we both have kind of shared our own personal experience, when it gets to a point where the environment is volatile or it does not provide a safe emotional space for the children, it's always best to really consider separating from that union and creating a space where the children will fare better emotionally, even if it is just one parent in the household.
Absolutely. Or the co-parenting relationships. And it's not always you make the decision, because I think that's part of it. Like, I think a lot of times well, was he abusive in terms of, was she abusive? Was there physical abuse? Was there infidelity? Like, what are the reasons? And I think we don't talk enough about the impact of, being partners,
Hmm.
for the partners individual health.
Yeah.
And, I always talk about the seven pillars of health. That's emotional, mental, spiritual, physical, financial, sexual, relationship slash community health. How is your personal work
Hmm.
by the marriage? Right? It
Hmm.
looks good on paper. There could be no big flags just because I'm sharing about some red flags in my relationship, particularly towards the end. It doesn't have to be present for it not to be a healthy environment for you. How is this relationship elevating and uplifting your health? And you really need to assess that.
Yeah.
And then that impact and the impact to your health, how does that impact your children's health?
Because a healthy mom or a healthy dad, that's where it all starts. I tell patients all the time that kids, we know this, kids are resilient, but what kids want most of all, because I see patients all the time, as I'm sure you do, who are struggling with this, who are battling with the issue, do I stay, do I leave? And when there are children involved, of course, that is one of the primary concerns there. One of the things that I really try to just emphasize with individuals that are struggling with that decision is that number one, kids are resilient, and number two, what kids most want are healthy parents, emotionally healthy parents. And unfortunately, in some cases, one parent can be more volatile than the other, or not as emotionally healthy as the other. But even if you can commit to being that solid, consistent, emotionally regulated parent, it makes a huge difference in the outcome of the children's mental health as well.
Absolutely. And that's the key, right? Like you children are incredibly resilient, and I think I say that over and over and over again for really almost anything. And they follow our lead.
Hmm.
So if we frame and if parents work together to frame the separation as this being the healthiest thing for our family, the children will even be more resilient in the space of that, being a united front, or even one of the parents helping the children cope and manage any of the challenges or things that is coming up for them.
Yeah. I'm going to go through this list really quickly. I'm going to ask
Okay.
you, Patrice, to kind of go out and come back in, because I know we'll still have your audio. That's the good, the
Absolutely.
good
And I
news.
just did that. I tried to go out, come back in, but
There
I
you,
couldn't
I
get it
see.
that
There
time.
you go. There
Okay.
you go. I
Okay.
needed to
And
see
I was like,
you.
look at you. I couldn't get it.
I needed to see,
Early morning.
and we were talking before we came on, and some of you, like Mercury's in retrograde. Some of you, what are they talking about? But when you said that, if you guys understood the number of hours today that we were up here just trying to figure out some stuff that should not have been a problem. So we're just happy to be here tonight, with you guys, and we figured it out. I think you said, Patrice, you said, leave it to a black woman. We're gonna figure out a way, one way or
We
another.
did. We sure
And
did.
so I just have to share. So literally, we have the audio coming from my phone and the video, here, which is not how it was supposed to play out, not at all. So if we, but we're here, and that's all that matters. That's all that matters. So I'm going to share this list, and at any time, cut in, share your thoughts, experiences. I'll do the same. So we're going to start with the pros of staying together. Okay. And as I mentioned before, it gives you time to take a breather in your relationship. So, instead of focusing on, you're having marital issues or relationship issues, and things just don't seem to be getting any better. Sometimes if you just make this commitment to say, you know what, we're just going to put the marriage on the back burner, and we're just going to commit to co-parenting these children and providing a healthy environment for them. That's a pro, because we know that there are even fewer. This is another pro to staying together. There are fewer behavioral issues from kids in two parent families. Two parent families, the children tend to do better even academically in school. As Patrice was saying, the a separation or a divorce can cause just a lot of adjustment issues in children, young teenagers, adolescent age. So if you can avoid that, of course, it fares better academically. More financial stability. We talked about that. Um, and it can reduce the negative feelings that occur during a divorce. It's nothing easy. You said it yourself. If you want to get to know somebody, divorce them, right? But it's nothing easy about the emotional, gets a fallout, the emotional fallout that oftentimes exists in divorce or in separation when you have young children. So staying together kind of just avoids that. I just even remember when years ago, it was 16, probably 16 years ago, when I separated, ultimately divorced from my children's father. And I just remember many people at that time making comments of, maybe you should stay together until the last child graduates, until the last child is 18. And I honestly, there was a woman at that time, and she was doing I was doing some just self growth work with her, and I considered her a spiritual advisor. And I remember her even suggesting that, why don't you just stay until the last child, because she said that's what she did. And at that time, my youngest was 3 years old, and the thought of, because neither one of us were happy at that time, but the thought of just remaining in this state of just pretending to be, just happy and well adjusted for my children, for 15 more years, I just could not wrap my head around that at all. Because my biggest fear was, I'm one of these people, I tell folks all the time, I'm so transparent that if you see I'm smiling, that's because I'm happy. If you see that I'm not smiling, it's probably because there's something going on and there's emotionally upsetting me. So I knew the thought of for 15 years putting on a front for my children would not just impact me, but it would also impact them. And that's one of the things I even share with patients that come in now. I think it's important. It's important, even though we're looking at these pros and we know there are plenty of pros to staying together. I oftentimes look at what's the not just immediate consequences of that, but what's the long term consequences of staying in a situation. And when I'm saying this, I'm speaking of relationships or marriages where there is, emotional upheaval, where there is a volatile environment, where, the children are being exposed to um, just unhealthy interactions between these two adults. My fear with that and what I see long term, not just short term, because short term we know emotionally it can cause all types of not just emotional issues, but physical issues. Kids who are in a unstable, emotionally unhealthy environment at home report more gastrointestinal issues. I remember during my divorce and separation, my oldest son was actually diagnosed with Crohn's at that time. And I knew it had a lot to do with the stress that was being experienced. But at the same time, I also knew my biggest fear was for my children to grow up in a household where two parents were constantly at each other and what that would do
Exactly.
for them long term as they went into adulthood and they started even forming their own relationships. So, Patrice, one of the things that I've noticed over the years with adults who parents did stay in it and stayed in it and it was not good, or stayed in it and it was volatile, or they stayed in it and it was always constant fighting, or just all these different dynamics that aren't advisable. I've noticed just a larger increase in anxiety disorders with these children, depression, mood disorders, but also interesting enough, and I want to know what your experience has been. I also have noticed an increase in even personality disorders, like
Mm,
borderline personality disorder.
mhm. I haven't seen the personality disorder as much, but definitely the anxiety, the depression. And then, what I find, because I'm kind of on the other end of the spectrum where I'm also looking at adults who parents stay together, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so, as a clinician, and I'm sure you did this as well, we thought about, I don't want to be parenting and living and rearing my children in such a way where they land on someone's counselor's couch,
Yeah, yeah,
right? To a certain extent. And you can't. I think everyone should be speaking and talking to someone.
absolutely.
However, what I mean is, I don't want to do harm or do something that is going to create these anxiety, depression, personality disorders, etc. And so, what I'm seeing in my clients is young adults through middle age and older who are their parents did stay together, should not have stayed together,
Hmm.
and the impact that had on them. And one of the impacts is now they're in marriages or in partnerships or in careers or in a lot of spaces where they don't feel like they get to lead, where they don't feel like they get to say, I can't handle this because their parents suffered through. So
Hmm.
a lot of times that messaging is, and so now these children have anxiety, depression, maybe personality disorder because they're not doing or honoring what their bodies and things like that are telling them to do. They're trying to muscle through these really hard situations and scenarios because that's what they saw their parents do.
Yes, yes. It creates an unhealthy model.
It creates an unhealthy model to stay for the children, if
Hmm.
you want to say it that way.
Hmm. Hmm.
Particularly when there is unhealthy things in the marriage. But even just to say, I'm staying for the children, that means you're not staying for yourself. That means you're doing something out of a sense of obligation. That means you're not upholding your own boundaries, right? Because a healthy boundary
Yes.
is saying yes because you want to, not because you feel obligated.
Hmm.
And so even just the nature of doing that is not healthy for the individual parent who is making that choice. Now, can you do that and create the healthiest environment possible? Yes. I think it would be remiss of us to not talk about how the pros and cons list that even you're listing is this ideal pros and cons list that is an absence of maybe pathology or also domestic violence, etc. That's a pros and cons list that only can be used or adopted when there's the absence of some really unhealthy practices
Hmm.
in the household. So I think that should be stated. I
Absolutely.
think families should look at their own pros and cons list. So the pros and cons of staying or going. And do it old school, right? Write it out. Write down the piece of paper. How do I minimize the pros, amplify the pros and minimize the cons of whatever decision I'm leaning towards?
That's such a great idea. Write it down. That is old school. Oh, a sheet of paper, get it out, or
A
get your
sheet of
phone out
paper.
and write it down. But draw that line down the middle, pros, cons, and write it out. One of the biggest, again, going back to my own experience, I remember being in a therapy session with marital counselors. And I remember one of the counselors asking, it was a husband and wife team, and in this particular session they both were in there. And I remember one of the counselors saying, what is your biggest fear? What is your biggest fear? And me and my ex, we were in there, in this session. And that was a question that hadn't been asked. I hadn't given it any thought at all. But the first thing that kind of just instinctually came out of my mouth, and what followed that was a flow of tears, was my biggest fear is that my children will not know what a happy relationship looks like.
Mm-hmm.
That was a huge fear for me because it wasn't okay, they won't know here when they're young, but my biggest fear was as they get older and grow into adults, if something wasn't done, you know, and at that point I figured it was I needed to leave. If that wasn't done, I would be raising 4 children who believe that this is what a marriage looks like. Um,
Absolutely.
and that just was just I couldn't even fathom that because that would have been just such a disservice as a mother that I was doing to my children, to leave them that legacy, so to speak.
Absolutely. Yeah, I echo that fear. I too went to couples counseling. And I think that's a message that both of us would want to say.
Hmm.
Working through these pros and cons, making this list and kind of figuring out what to do, you should be working with a licensed professional or someone that can guide you and your partner through this decision. You're doing that individually, but you should also be doing that as a couple if your partner will participate with you. And sometimes we know that is
Hmm.
not what happens. So, same. My biggest fear was a little bit different. I had two. The thing that literally I uttered some words, and then that later that night, I told my ex husband I wanted a divorce. I was talking to actually his mom, and we were talking about how children grow up and whether or not they respect their parents or not. And we were
Mm.
talking about parental respect and how you have your children. And I was emphatically kind of sharing, like, oh, my children, one of the ways I want to raise my children with is a lot of respect for me. And I want to live my life in such a way that my children will respect me. So they'll come to me for that advice. They'll allow me to be a support to them. They'll be respectful of me, et cetera, et cetera. They'll follow my lead, so to speak.
Hmm.
And I said, and I'm living that way. I said, but you know what? I said this out loud. I said, the only thing that one day I feel like my children will grow up and not respect me for is the way I let their father treat me.
Mm.
The minute I released those
Mm.
words from my mouth, I knew I had to leave
Yeah, yeah.
because my fear was that my children would grow up, particularly my daughter, would grow up and believe that this, like you said, is what love is, and that they would eventually stop respecting me for the way in which they were seeing their dad treat me.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not painting this picture that he's a horrible guy, he's
Exactly.
bad,
Yeah.
but we just get into
Ditto.
these situations where we stop treating each other well because of whatever may be going on for us. And I didn't want that to be the example
Yeah, I
in
was
how I rear my
yeah,
children.
such a great points there. I was reading again as I was preparing for this how people put so much more thought and effort into divorcing than they ever do getting married. which
Absolutely.
probably explains, or when they ever do going into partnerships, because we know all partnerships are marriage, but that probably explains the high prevalence, just one variable to the high prevalence of the divorce rate that we experience and we see just as a whole, not just confined to one culture, but so much more thought, effort, energy, passion goes into divorcing than ever goes into marriage. Um, but the bottom line is there's no right answer. Would you agree with that? It's all individual. It's all based on everyone's own situation. I agree totally 100% with you, Patrice, that when there is abuse involved, be it physical or even verbal abuse, that's just a no brainer to me. There needs to be immediate separation right there because, again, you're really setting the stage to just make your children more susceptible to all types of mental health issues, predominantly the anxiety and the depression. And the reason I even say personality disorders, what I've seen like over these years that I've been doing this with adults who stayed there, and it's because oftentimes when you're in this type of dysfunctional environment, there's a disconnect that has to occur for you to be able to even cope in that type of emotional upheaval that's just part of the norm of your everyday experience. So for a lot of children to even deal with that or cope with that, there's a disconnect from self that has to occur. um, and the issue is when even when they're out of that environment, they grow up, they leave, they go off to college or leave home. That disconnect does not automatically just mend itself because they've been so used to operating and navigating life through this very wounded part of themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that is something that needs to be kind of talked through. It's not cookie cutter.
Hmm.
We are sharing our perspective to kind of give others permission to begin to think about what I need to do for myself, right?
Yeah.
We're posing the question, should you stay with your for the children? To me, if that's why you're staying, unless you are in an ideal situation where there's a optimal health and you all can make the decision to co-parent, which I even offered in my relationship. I think that's a step, and even the couples and the families I support, most people think about that alternative. Hey, let's just be roommates and do stay and do this for the kids. Most people will
Yeah.
look at that as an option, but you have to weigh the pros and cons. Again, and it should be assessed from the perspective of health. What is the healthier situation or environment for my children?
Hmm.
The marriage, and you need to be honest with yourself. And a lot of times, as parents, I was doing it as well. I was lying to myself that my children didn't see the things that was happening.
Hmm.
They weren't impacted by the things. And even if you're doing like the stellar job of not arguing in front of the children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, children can feel energy,
They
and
can
they know
feel
when mama
energy.
or daddy or their family members are in a bad mood or have had a bad day. If you've been traumatized earlier that day by an argument, that is showing up in what you're putting on the dinner table and what's
Absolutely.
happening at the dinner table. So there is impossible for you to be in an unhealthy situation and not show up with that lack of health for your children. And that's kind of the message. But it's very individual. Is
Very
this
individual.
healthier or is this healthier?
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
only for the children, but for myself. Because the children are children and they really are resilient, Dr. Rose, as you keep saying. But can you sustain it? Right? Is it sustainable for you?
Yeah.
I'm old school, and I actually am one of the people that I think that the parent should get the big piece of chicken and eat first. And I know there's lots of controversy. I'm getting a lot of stuff, and I say that not because the parents should not eat first. I have literally sacrificed for my children. We all have. But what I mean by that is, if I get sick, if mama gets sick, or daddy gets sick, or the parental figure gets sick, and we no longer can care for the children, everything stops.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything.
So if mother or father or the parental caregiver begins to not be able to function, and now the relationship causing them to be depressed, anxiety, and go into maybe even having personality disorders because they're disassociating or, splitting because of the trauma they're experiencing. The children are not going to be well because of that.
Yeah, yeah. Stay or go, the kids are going to feel it. They're going to feel it. Well, if you do decide to stay, I think we both agree that you have to make an everyday, deliberate, conscious, intentional effort to create a low conflict environment for everyone involved. And again, low conflict doesn't mean we just don't argue in front of the kids. It means that because kids know. I share there was no, I was married to my children's father for, 11, I think the marriage was about 11 years, 11, 12 years. And there was no, for the most part, until probably last year, there wasn't arguing. There wasn't any of that fighting. Honestly, we both worked kind of different shifts. And so it was just, I think we were able to sustain as long as we did is because we were spending so much time apart, if that makes sense. But I remember probably 6 months after we separated during the divorce process, my son, who was about 8 at the time, he came into my office and he sat down, very matter of factly in the chair, next to my desk in the office. And he sat down and he kind of leaned back, crossed his legs, and he said to me point blank, he said, "You know what, Mom? You and Dad really didn't have much in common anyway." And that kind of just blew me away because this is an 8-year-old, an 8-year-old who, at that time kids were still outside playing every day. And you're
Yeah.
just thinking they're not even absorbing all of this, but this was something that was very obvious even to a child. But again, the energy, as you stated, Patrice, is real. So a low conflict household isn't necessarily a household that just doesn't argue, because a high conflict household can be a household where there's no communication, where there's no communication, where the kids can feel the energy, and cut through it like a knife.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And, and so you really have to assess and be honest with yourself. What are we doing, and how is this impacting all the areas of our health,
Hmm.
and will there be an elevation of health for the parents and then ultimately the children as a result of leaving, or will there be more health if we stay? And it's a individual perspective,
Yeah.
but you have to be honest. I think I say to myself, I'll be honest with you, Dr. Rose, I lied to myself for the honestly probably, I divorced my son like 6 years of the marriage. I was lying to myself that
Wow.
they weren't impacted by what was happening.
Hmm.
And it wasn't high conflict. So it wasn't high conflict. Like, we were pretty family, the cute family
Yeah.
with the pictures, and we did the newsletters on Christmas. And, my ex husband and I, even now, when we're good, we're great. And
Hmm.
we, present very well, and we co parent very well, and we really show up as this really beautiful family. But there were just some things in the background, under the surface, some insidious things that was not working, some serious lack of health that was derailing us being able to be our best and healthiest selves, and that was seen with the children. And so I just lied to myself. It's okay. This is better than divorce. But I do think what we're not hitting on enough, and I want maybe we can continue the conversation, or even in the comments after,
Yeah.
around people who stay from a shame and a stigma perspective.
Mm.
I didn't want to be a statistic. I didn't want to be a black woman with two babies, and divorced. I didn't.
Yeah.
And I stayed for that reason too. Yes, I stayed because I believed that the children were better off. I didn't want my children to not. I came from a unhealthy family background where I don't feel like my father was technically in the picture,
Hmm.
and I didn't want my children to have that same experience. I went to my counselor. I continued counseling after the divorce even, and I would really say and share with him. I would say, I don't want them to not have a father. I don't want them to not have a father in the home. Like, I was just so crippled by that
Yeah.
because of my own experience. And he often would remind me, my counselor, Mr. Baker, which I reference in my sessions with my clients a lot, he would remind me they do have a relationship with their father. Even if you don't necessarily
Hmm.
have the relationship you believe you would have with their father, they still have this great opportunity. And so I think that's part of the conversation too. We don't want
Yeah.
to just highlight this dysfunctional or toxic or unhealthy environment. Are you staying for the wrong reason? Religious, stigma, shame, because you don't want to be a statistic, because of the even unfavorable statistics in the African American
Yes.
community. Is that making you sad?
Yes, yes. Great point. Great point. I know. I remember when I made the decision. I even remember my mom at the time. She later became one of my biggest supporters, but she was just so upset, and understandably so, because my parents stayed together forever. My um, parents were married 18 years before my father had a massive stroke at the age of 36, and he lived another 18 years. And my mom took care of him, all those years. And so, it was all about staying together. And I remember her first words is that you can't divorce, not you don't, but you can't divorce someone that you have 4 children with. And it kind of just blew me away. But at the same time, as you said, messaging, because if we stay and we stay in an unhealthy marriage, that's what we're teaching our children, because we are learning everything from what we're observing at home. And so what I even observed, even watching my mom all those years care for my dad, my observations was that you stay regardless for many years. And again, like I said, I think that's what even initiated the marriage. I share even in my book about this, my book Bloom 7 Steps, about how it was more of a marriage out of obligation because I had a kid, and I was taught that if you have a child with someone, that means you have to marry them. There were no if, ands, or buts about that. And again, this goes back into we don't give a lot of thought. We're just taking what we learn. But I also learned the 12 years before my father got sick, what I saw was a rarity, and that was especially in my community, because it was two parents that loved each other. I saw the love, I saw the affection, I saw the playfulness, I saw the passion, I saw all of that stuff. And so I had this dichotomy. I was caught between two worlds of wanting to have that type of marriage that I saw as a little girl, but also feeling like I had to stay in this marriage that wasn't necessarily fulfilling for the sake of the kids. But when my own mental health and well-being started to be compromised, that's when I knew, for my sake, like they said, put the oxygen mask on yourself first. I knew for my sake as well as for the sake of my children, I had to make this big move that no one in my family, I had two older sisters, and they weren't divorced at the time. I had a mom who stayed in it with a sick husband, and I did this, and it was a lot of criticism, critique. I felt very alone at times with this decision. But in hindsight, I'll tell you, I know that was the best possible decision that I made for not only myself, but my children, who are all thriving, beyond thriving now, because they were able to not be subjected to a home where, again, like I said, when I felt my own mental health suffering as a result, when I felt myself even doing things or feeling certain ways that was not characteristic of me, I knew I had to make a move for my own sake. And so I wouldn't disconnect. Like I'm telling you how people oftentimes, because trauma and um, just not being authentic in who you are, that will disconnect you from yourself inevitably, and lead to a lot of those issues. I want to share this also before we close up here. Let me share this. So this right here is just talking about how you can increase the likelihood of good outcomes, and hopefully you guys can see that. I'll share it. I'll share this graphic also on the status, and I see there are people on, and you feel free to ask a question. Put it right there in the chat if you want to ask a question before we log off tonight. But here's some, and Patrice, feel free to chime in as well. I'll just read down this list. But this is from Psychology Today. This was a couple years ago, 2019, so a few years ago. And this is a list that they composed that increases the likelihood of good outcomes for children who parents decide to separate. Um, so the likelihood of good outcomes for children is increased when at least one of the parents, and it's interesting they say this goes back to what we're saying, right? Because they're saying at least one of the parents. So it's not even necessary that both parents do what this corresponding list. It's ideal if both could, but at least one of the parents ensures the children feel safe and secure, is warm, affectionate, and open with the children, respects and speaks well of the other parent. That's a big one.
Big one.
Oh, that's a big one.
Big one.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know about your experience, but I'm hearing stuff now that just kind of just pains me of what my kids had to hear, at a young age.
Absolutely.
And again, to hear kids now in their mid-20s talk about things that were said when they were 8 or 9, and they're describing it, and you can see that there's still a level of hurt there. It's so important for parents to recognize the impact that that has lifelong.
Absolutely. And have open dialogue. It's okay to ask your children and create the space for
Thank
them to
you.
ask you any in the hard question. So my children were actually very angry with me when we divorced
Hmm.
because I did do a good job of keeping things from them. And, you know, we had a great family and a great life. But I was working really, really hard to maintain that facade, honestly, and it came crumbling down when I almost crumbled under the weight of it. And
Mm.
so my children were really angry with me, and so I let them share and talk through that anger very openly. And then I also created a space where if they wanted just always to talk about anything, whether it's about me or their dad, or they were confused about something maybe he was sharing. So just keeping that open dialogue. But
Yes.
absolutely, it's best if the parents can be respectful of one another, but even one good role model in that parenting. One, like if you're leaving because you need to gain health for yourself so you can be a healthy and whole parent, one healthy and whole parent really does create a healthier outcome for the children, which is basically what this list is
Yes,
on.
yes. And it may mean you have to put more effort in, because I can remember having to do damage control with some situations where you're exhausted, but it's for the sake of your kids. Otis Bellinger, who's a local, he's a therapist as well, so he chimed in, and I just want to read. He says, if you are with someone that puts you in a mentally and emotionally deficit, rethink and retreat. Rethink, and I'm so glad. And he says he's on a daddy daughter date now, but he snuck off to hear this, and it was on spot. So I appreciate that feedback. And Cami asks, now that the children are adults, do you think it still affects them? I totally think it still affects them. I hear my kids all the time. We have an open dialogue, but they'll say, "Oh, you know how the track record with marriage around here, that type of thing." And I like you mentioned, Patrice. It's important, even that now that all my children are adults, we have open dialogues. We talk about the impact that that may have had on their outlooks. I have two daughters who have no memory because they were so young when we divorced, but there are no memories of that. But there were some things said to them, even as recent as a few years ago, that they came back that they were extremely hurt about, that I know impacts them. But it's important to have that dialogue, Cami. So yes, it still affects them. Kids are going to feel it one way or another. So if I would have stayed, it would have affected them. I left, it affected them. I had to weigh the pros and cons and say which is going to affect them less, and make a
Absolutely.
decision not based on just, okay, my belief, but what I know professionally as well, and again, to be able to see them thrive in many ways, and not to say that they're not impacted or affected, or doesn't affect even their adult relationships now. I won't even say that that's not fact, but the fact is that I think also showing them that it's not okay to stay in something that you're not happy in. And it's okay to leave, even if people want to attach shame or stigma or failure to that. I always tell my kids sometimes failure is a prerequisite to success, and we have to fail sometimes so we can fly. And of course, failure is a perception and in the eye of subjective eye of the beholder. But that, as you mentioned, with the shame, is one of the reasons that prevents people from doing that. So I'm going to finish
Absolutely.
up this list with the few minutes we have. It's important for that parent or parents to facilitate ongoing, regular, and dependable contact with the other parent. Has clear and reasonable expectations of the children, provides respectful monitoring, supports empowerment and autonomy, teaches good problem solving and coping skills, maintains a network of social support with extended family, neighbors, and community. So, the kids should still be able to see both sides of the family. I remember my youngest children, like I said, they were just 3 and 4 when the separation happened. So they had no memory of us ever being together, but as they got older, I can remember one of my children had a friend over and mentioned to her friend, I could overhear their conversation, and she's saying to her friend, basically, it's great having two divorced parents. She says, because you get two Christmases, you get two, and I'm on this one. She's seeing the benefits that she actually was able to get from that situation. But again, this is someone who did not have a recollection of us even being married, but it just goes to show again their resiliency and being able to, as long as they have that primary parent or two parents that are going to demonstrate just emotional intelligence and healthiness, that kids will do fine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Same. My children have really great outcomes. They'll be 17 and 19 this year. You will see the impact, and there will be some residual effects. But that's any part of life, right? Like you can't. That's the thing about life and living in this humanity, particularly in the social construct. It's kind of hardwired for struggle. You can't live a moment in this life and not come away unscathed to a certain extent.
Hmm.
It's how you teach your children to cope and be healthy. I'll be honest and share that, from my perspective, I did make the choice to leave from a self full perspective. I knew that I would be healthier and be able to be a better mom
Mm,
for my children, and be my healthiest and happiest and whole self for them. And I wanted to give them that opportunity and that option
that's
myself.
amazing. Yeah, yeah. Most people know I'm really big on vision. So I remember just wanting, creating a vision of what I wanted, not just my children and my life to look like, because all of us can have lives that look amazing, right? If we can set that up. But I had a vision of what I wanted life to feel like. I wanted of the and so when I created that vision in my head of what I wanted my children emotionally to be able to just benefit from and feel, and what I wanted life to feel like, anything that did not match that vision, anything that did not match and was not compatible with that emotional set point of just emotional healthiness and stability and love and just excitement in the home, anything that did not where it was not in alignment with that, I knew that was a direction I had to not head in, basically. I had to kind of just really, that was my litmus test. That was my GPS. Like we have GPS for cars. My GPS was, this doesn't feel good. It may look good because, like you mentioned, Patrice, people, I remember we would go out to dinner, and the waitresses or waiters would always comment on the beautiful family and the well-mannered kids and all of that good stuff that makes you, so everything look good. But if it doesn't feel good, it's going to have its impact on you again, not just emotionally but physically as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So any parting words you have for us?
Yeah, I think the parting words is to do that check in with yourself. And although we're kind of centering that because we're women, and we're moms. We're centering the conversation around the women. But men and fathers and other partners, they experience this too.
Mm-hmm.
And they often feel like they can't leave or can't make the relationship, or even, sometimes it's not about, I have friends and family who they won't move away or take a different job or do anything for themselves
Mm-hmm.
because they're worried about the impacts to the children.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, in those instances, I want you to really take a critical look and that self assessment and determine where is the greater amount of help for everyone involved. And if you're making this self sacrificing, obligatory commitment to do something, it's probably not rooted in the best health of everyone, particularly yourself.
Great, great advice. Great advice. So, one of the things I like to ask guests when I have them on, and this is how we'll end it, I want you to share with us what's the best piece of advice that you've ever gotten.
Oh, the best piece of advice I've ever
And it
gotten.
doesn't have to even pertain to this topic, just something that people can take away with them.
Best piece of advice I've ever gotten. Probably from my own mother. The best piece of advice, it's more so not advice per se, but a way of living, and that is something's going to happen to make things better, right?
Mm,
And so when I'm always in the face of it, something's gonna happen. She
yeah.
would always say something's gonna happen, right? And that something's gonna happen that might be whatever that needs to happen to make everything all better, to make meaning maybe out of even the discomfort you're experiencing. And so that's my best piece of advice, to be reminded that here's an alternative. Right now I'm in the darkness. Right now I might be going through something that's really uncomfortable. But something's gonna happen to
Something's
make it
gonna
all
happen.
better.
Something's gonna happen. You can put that on a t-shirt.
You can put that on the t-shirt. Okay, I already do that.
Something's gonna happen. I appreciate you. I
Thank you
appreciate
so
you
much.
so much, and I appreciate everyone for hanging in there with us, even with the technical difficulties that we weren't expecting, but we pushed through. And we've gotten some great feedback on here. But please continue to put any at you. This will be on replay. You'll be able to play it over. If you have questions or comments, feel free to either put them in the comments section or send us a message. Myself, you can follow Patrice on Face. Where can they follow? Let
Absolutely.
folks know.
Facebook, Instagram, and I put my contact information, how to follow me, and all of that in the comments, and some of the things that I reference, I'll put in the comments as well.
That's
So they
awesome.
can follow me that way. But thank you for bearing with me with all of my technical difficulties on this side. We're in Mercury retrograde, but I'm
Patrice.
glad to be here.
Patrice.
Yes.
Something's gonna happen.
Yes, something's gonna happen. I love it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And catch us in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about narcissism and being in relationships with narcissists. So catch us 2 weeks. Have a great time.